start the recording and we'll go ahead and get started. I would imagine as we live in a world of back-to-back meetings, we'll have more folks jump on as we get going. I welcome everybody to the first 2025 Community of Practice. My name is Amy Dessenberg-Wines. I help support the Iowa Coalition for Integration and Employment. I am just delighted to have Iowa and / Illinois with us. Misty and Tammy and Jenny, and I'm going to let them talk a little bit more about themselves to talk to us about benefits planning. And we're going to have 2 sessions on this. And if things were warranted and they were available and people want to dive deeper, we can do that if they're able to do that as well. Because I think what we found with the community of practice is sometimes it's just enough to give you a taste and then you have more questions. Do you want to go a little bit deeper? So just keep in mind if there's things that you think would help to go deeper, we can sure do that. I am going to put in the chat is a link to the folder for today's presentation and the materials. So if you have any problems, let me know. I didn't ask, I'm going to ask you, Misty, if people have questions throughout today's session, do you want them to hold those questions, put them in the chat, or unmute and ask you when they have them?
Either way works fine. I think if we put them in the chat, we can go back to them at the end and kind of cover them there. If there's something that we'll keep an eye on it, if there's something that hops out, one of us will stop the other presenter. So we'll do a mix. How about that?
That sounds great. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to you, Misty.
Fantastic. Well, thank you guys so much for allowing us to come and join you today and kick off 2025. Our WIPA team, although small but mighty, is super excited to be with you. I think Jenny's going to run our presentation today. A little bit about myself. I'm the project director and community work incentive coordinator for the Work Incentive Planning and Assistance, long word, WIPA project at Disability Rights Iowa. I personally have been at Disability Rights Iowa for a little over 13 years. I've been doing benefits planning since around 2009 when I was lucky enough to be underneath the wing of Sheila Stokel and Susie Paulson when they were the WIPAs for Iowa. So I'm incredibly grateful and lucky for all of their mentorship and guidance. I'm based out of the Clear Lake, Mason City area, but as we're going to talk about today, we cover a lot more area than just that. And I'll let my other 2 colleagues introduce themselves. Tammy?
Hi, everybody. I'm Tammy Crouch. So I've been a benefits planner with Misty for a while. Prior to this, I worked for Iowa Workforce Development as a Promise Jobs case manager and then disability navigator and disability resource coordinator. So I've been in this world for a long time. I've been with Disability Rights Iowa now for about 8 years. So I love benefits planning. It's something that I do every day. I love the challenge and being able to learn new things with it. And I'm just really, also I think I said I'm based in Sioux City. So yeah, I'm on the western side of the state. So Jenny, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenny Lyons, and I've been with Disability Rights Iowa just about 3.5 years now. I got to join the dynamic duo of Misty and Tammy to round out our team. Previously, I worked in higher education, specifically in the disability realm, and so have gotten to see a couple different sides of disability services. And I'm based out of Cedar Falls, Waterloo.
Thanks, guys. Jenny, left side. So as we're getting rolling, like Amy mentioned, this is going to be kind of a 2-part series. Today, we're going to talk about some basics in order to get somebody involved with WIPA services, how to even find us, the best way to do that, a little bit about work incentives along the way, kind of our road trip analogies, different things like that. And then when you come back to join us for part 2, we're going to dive a little more deeper into the transition side of things. Because the rules are different for both sides of the programs, and we're going to talk about that, that's why we thought it'd be best to split it apart because it's a lot of information coming at you at one time. So be sure to come back for part two. Um, as we get rolling today, a couple of our highlights are going to be figuring out or explaining which programs are which, the SSDI side of things, the SSI side of things. We're going to touch on Ticket to Work, ABLE accounts, and like I mentioned, how to get your beneficiaries referred to get WIPA support at that no cost level. Okay, moving on. Next slide. Thanks. So the definition of disability, we always kind of hear it is one thing or the other depending on what program or type of support that somebody is tapping into. For disability benefits for Social Security, that is really narrowed down and pretty strict into the ability to engage in any substantial gainful activity, SGA, you're going to hear that again, because of medical, determinable physical or mental impairment that can be expected to last more than 12 months or that ends in death. It's kind of a harsh description, but that's Social Security for you. There is no cut, it's all cut and dry for them a lot of times. Next slide. And just to one thing that I would mention also about the disability piece of that, that is determined by disability determination services here in Iowa. And so that is definitely a process as somebody applies for benefits that they would have to go through to help Social Security make that decision as to whether or not somebody is eligible for either of those programs. So a little bit about what WIPA is. Like I mentioned, the long version of that is Work Incentive Planning and Assistance. We're actually a grant-funded program through Social Security. A lot of people think we are Social Security, but we're not. We're grant-funded under them, and we're required to provide individualized benefits planning to folks who are receiving Title II disability benefits, and that falls under the SSDI or Social Security Disability Insurance, the Childhood Disability Benefits, CDB, or if someone is a disabled widow or widower beneficiary, then they can get benefits under that as well. And also supplemental security income or SSI, all due to disability. And we can start working with somebody fairly early, even in that before the transition age groups that we kind of have thinking about in our heads. We can start with somebody as early as age 14 and we go all the way up through retirement. Although we know that's a moving target, at least I think it is. I never seem to get any closer, but right now it's 67. And we can work with somebody all the way up through then. The biggest piece, and we hope that you take away today, is that there has to be employment somewhere in that thought process. They have to be on the continuum at some place. That doesn't mean they have to be working, but they have to be contemplating work. They have to be interested in it, actively looking for employment, already working. Maybe they even have a raise or a position offered to them that they could move up. Those kind of things all are requirements of our services, as well as self-employment. And that could be even somebody who's thinking about self-employment. They don't actually have to be doing self-employment activities at the time. It's just if they're thinking about it, we can have a conversation with them. Next slide. So a couple of the goals that we think about when we're providing services is one of those is definitely to improve employment outcomes for people who receive disability benefits. We all know on this call, nobody's getting rich by staying on disability benefits. And it's not our job to get somebody off benefits or hold them on benefits. What we're doing is giving them a clear, accurate picture of what it will look like and what kind of impact, if any, that they may have from work earnings on disability benefits and other supports they receive. And that could be food assistance, housing, Medicaid, Medicare. The list is long, and we'll talk about a few of those today. And the other piece of that is definitely to increase that economic self-sufficiency because, again, we know nobody's getting rich and it's not even always about the money, right? It's about getting out of your house, learning some new skills. Maybe it's learning new soft skills. Maybe it's a whole new career. Maybe it's just dipping your toe back in after a life-changing injury. We don't even narrow it down from there. We want people to have a lot of options, and employment is always in our minds and wants to be part of that conversation early on as we possibly can. Like it says on the slide, we want to enable beneficiaries to make that educated decision about employment that meets their needs where they're at with their interests. Next slide. So Amy mentioned a little bit of our coverage area, Iowa and Illinois, and you're going to see on the slide that everything that sees a blue dot, that's us. So all of Iowa, all 99 counties, and 34 counties in that little northwest corner there of Illinois. No wrong door to get us, and we're going to talk to you about that in a little bit. Next slide. We cover a lot of area, but we do many, many services virtually. We just wanted to give you a little closer view of what that looks like for Illinois. You can see those bordering counties there that we cover, and that is a lot of work in the Quad Cities, up in Dubuque, kind of right there on the river, those kind of things. We do a lot of work in those counties as well. Next slide. So what are the kind of benefits? You heard me mention Title II and SSI. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So with SSDI, that Social Security Disability Insurance, that is one of the ones that you can have auxiliary benefits under. You can also be able to be eligible for Medicare after you receive 24 months worth of checks. That is one that has different benefit amounts because that's based on a person's individualized work history. So that's why it is super important for us to know which benefit somebody receives, because we don't want to go through an hour discussion to find out they actually have the other program. Where you'll see on the slide a brief description of SSI, Supplemental Security Income. That's much more needs-based, although there's the disability piece of that. It also reflects back to what your income resources and asset limits are. If you're over that $2,000, you may not be eligible for SSI. And once we dive into the transition piece, we're going to talk a little bit more on how SSI looks for those folks who are turning 18, and what the statistics are on that a little bit. But the difference between the two programs is that with SSI, there is no auxiliary benefit for dependents. And the maximum amount on that is the max for everyone. In 2025, that just went up to $967 for an individual and $1,450 for a couple. You'll notice that that doesn't change for anyone. That's the highest you can get when you're receiving SSI. And along with that, as I mentioned, the resource and asset limit on SSI is $2,000 for an individual, $3,000 for a couple. That hasn't changed in a very, very long time, unfortunately. And we have fingers crossed that that will be something that we'll actually see happen, in our lifetime. Would be really nice. But in comparison to the Title II benefit, there is no resource and asset limit. I know the three of us have had conversations where we're like, Bill Gates could be having Title II, even though he has as much money as he does, as long as he's not working over that SGA amount. So that's a little bit of the differences. The other piece that's unique to Iowa is that Medicaid is automatic. If you have SSI or you're eligible for SSI, Medicaid comes along with that. For our Illinois folks, that isn't how it works. But for Iowa, it is something that comes right along with it. Next slide. So what happens after somebody refers one of their folks they're working with to WIPA? So we have beneficiaries complete and submit some releases or program documents. That would include a third-party release if there's other individuals involved, a release for Social Security so that we can kind of help to be a liaison for them, as well as what we call an information sheet or a get to know you better sheet, because we want to make sure we have all of the information from the beneficiary side of things before we take that deep dive into our investigative work with Social Security and other supports. And that's part of what we do is we verify all of that information so that we can better understand the individual's benefits and be able to translate that to the folks that we're working with. Because I'm sure everybody on the call understands that Social Security doesn't make their information very easy to understand. So that's part of something that we really pride ourselves on, is to be able to relay that information in understandable language for everyone. The other piece of that is that our community work incentive coordinators, or CWICs, the beneficiary and other members of their employment support team, then they meet to discuss the next steps. Sometimes that's just us and the beneficiary. Sometimes it's us, a beneficiary, a guardian, and a payee. It depends on the situation. It's also, if a provider agency is working with that person, they can be at the table as well. Our philosophy is the more ears that hear this information, everybody on the same page, is a much better situation for the beneficiary. So if that beneficiary wants us to have their case manager or their employment specialist or job coach on the call, we're going to do our best to make that happen. Once that meeting happens, our community work incentive coordinator writes a benefits summary and analysis, or a BSA, and we outline everything that the beneficiary's employment goal will entail, along with how the impact of their current benefits and wages and all of that works together. Sometimes, depending on how we get that referral and what the kind of mix is and availability, we may sometimes meet before that BSA is written, just to kind of get a good feel where everything is at, then write the BSA and maybe meet with somebody again. It really varies on how the beneficiary wants to do it and what everybody's availability is. So it can differ a little bit, but this is kind of our base process. And then, of course, the CWIC and the beneficiary and the employment support team, like I mentioned, can meet to review that again and develop a follow-up plan for future critical touch points. And that's something I want to make sure everybody understands, is that as far as WIP is concerned, we never close your file. Once you've got us, right, Bill? I know you're shaking your head. I can't see you on the screen, but I know you are. Because we feel like when we say critical touch points, we know that things happen in your life, right? Not everybody stays at a job for 20 years. People do different jobs. Other things come up. Maybe they get an inheritance. Who knows what that might look like? But once they're connected to us, they can reconnect back with us, and we can help them through those other touch points. Next slide, please. Part of our investigative work that we do is asking Social Security to send us a BPQI, or a benefits planning query. And really, a benefits planning query is a snapshot in time, if you will, that gives us a good jumping off point to take a look at what Social Security has on that individual's record, compare that to what that individual is telling us, and kind of cross-check all of that information. Because a lot of times, what the beneficiary is telling us might not be accurately shown on that BPQI. And then it's up to us and the beneficiary to kind of work through what that looks like and how we can get that corrected. Some of the things that we see on those is listed here on the slide. That could be status of beneficiary's disability, like which program they actually receive benefits from. Sometimes work history, health insurance. It will tell us if they have Medicare or Medicaid eligible. And also, it tells us, when their next medical review is scheduled. Sometimes that's not accurate. I like to tell people that 98.8% of the time it's accurate, but not always. So that's part of our investigative work that we do. And it's so essential to what we're doing in this process because, like I mentioned earlier, each program has such a separate, different set of rules as to how earnings impact those benefits. We want to really make it clear which program they're receiving from so that we can give them accurate, current information and help them figure out what is going on with Social Security. If everything's correct, great. They might have had work history in the past. We want to make sure that's all current and accurate on those records. Next slide. I think I am turning the ropes over to Jenny.
You are. So you get to hang with me for a little bit, and we're going to talk about the SSDI side of things. So we've put a star on some of the work incentives we're going to touch on, some of the big ones being trial work period, the extended period of eligibility, and then some very specific ones, including IRWI, an impairment-related work expense, subsidy, and PASS. We always can talk about any one of these for a very long time. So if in the future anyone is interested in more in-depth information and training on, let's say, PASS, I know that's Misty's favorite and could talk about that for probably 7 years. So we would love to be able to chat more, but just want to get your feet a little bit wet and understand some things to maybe be thinking of when you're working with beneficiaries. So you will, if you don't already know, we are a very analogy-based team. So we like to think about different ways to convey this information because it is very confusing. We live it every single day, so it seems pretty easy for us after a while. But if someone is never hearing this information or they're just getting it written down, it can be very confusing and feeling like you're going to hit a landmine at any time. So we have a little road trip analogy, and we're going to walk through that together so you can hopefully see a little bit more what does and doesn't happen when someone goes to work and they're receiving a Title II benefit. So the very first part is that trial work period, or TWP. And that's the very first part of that road trip. I like to say if someone's trying to get from Iowa to Virginia, you're at the very first part, getting ready to go. So for that trial work period, that's where someone will have 9 months where they can earn as much as they want, and there's no ceiling, there's no cap, there's nothing that says you have to be limited in how much you earn. Because the whole point is to be able to test out work. The individual hasn't worked or has worked maybe very minimally since they've gotten on disability benefits and don't know, can I go back to that same career? Can I even work full time? How many hours can I work? So the whole trial work is to let them test out without seeing anything change in their benefits. Now, those 9 months are not necessarily consecutive. So if you look at the graphic on the screen, our little traveler on the road, there's 9 stones. And so they're not necessarily touching because Social Security doesn't look at, someone started a job in January and they automatically count out 9. They look at how much did that person earn. And so for 2025, if someone has trial work months available, they have to earn at least $1,160 to use one of those 9 months. I like to say if, let's say, someone started a job and they're earning $1,000 gross in a month, they're still at Quick Star, depending on do you want the Dots pretzels? Do you want the cheeseburger? They haven't fully left. They haven't hit the interstate yet. Now, if someone is self-employed, they still have a trial work period. Social Security does take into account the amount they're earning, but it could also be the number of hours they're working. So if someone's looking at a self-employment venture, they'll want to keep track of the number of hours. So even if someone didn't earn at least that 1,160 for 2025, if they worked at least 80 hours, that would be considered using one of their trial work months. Now, Misty had mentioned, and she said we were going to get back to it, the substantial gainful activity, or SGA. And that definition is, the individual is performing significant duties in their work for profit. The idea being that you're no longer disabled because you're able to work and sustain yourself. So for 2025, if anyone's watching this in a future year, please look at the correct numbers because they typically change. But 2025, if someone is not considered blind by Social Security standards, that limit is $1,620. If someone is blind, that's $2,700, and that's gross. As Social Security like to say, everyone pays taxes, so they look at gross amounts. Now, if someone gives us a call and wants the 2-second easy answer, magically, what's their limit to be able to earn if they wanted to maintain their benefit, that SG amount would be the answer. However, SGA is a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of different work incentives that go into that decision. And so someone may have earned over that amount, but due to different work incentives can bring down their countable income and make it to where they're not technically considered working over SGA. So while there's a very easy answer and you'll hear numbers today, there's a lot more that goes into it. So we really want to talk to someone individually to know their situation, because Misty, Tammy, and I all have situations where someone, it looks like they're working over, but they have a subsidy, they have an IRWI, they have something they can tap into, and that brings their countable income down. So always like to highlight that just because we make it sound a lot easier, but unfortunately, Social Security doesn't make it always that easy. So let's say you get through your 9 months, you got through all of the stones, it's only then that we finally made it to that boardwalk. So as a reminder, during those stones, they're only looking at, did you earn at least enough to use one of those 9 months? That SGA amount doesn't exist until you hit this boardwalk. Now, let's say someone, they used their 9th month was January. The very next month, in that example, February, that's when their extended period of eligibility, or EPE, will begin. Now, unlike the trial work period, that is consecutive. So Social Security will literally count out 36 months, and that's your time on this boardwalk. I won't make you count, but if you look at the boardwalk, there are 36 boards on it to represent every single month of your EPE. Now, the nice thing is, during this extended period of eligibility, regardless of your pay status, whether you're getting a payment every month or it's paused, you still have Medicare. And that's actually typically one of the last things that would ever go if someone's goal was to work off of benefits. Oftentimes, that's the biggest question we get is, maybe someone is okay with working off of benefits, but when are they no longer going to have that Medicare? And there's even ways they can buy into Medicare once it goes away. So that's a big piece that we really like to highlight, is that healthcare isn't going to go away just because your benefit has paused during that EPT. Now, what is happening on this boardwalk? I said that now they're going to be looking at that SGA amount. So we like to think about SGA, it's like a speed limit. So continuing on the road trip analogy, if someone is earning under that SGA amount, that's like if someone's going 60 in a 65 zone. In theory, no one should care. You should be able to keep going, nothing happens. If you start going 70, 75 in a 65 zone, someone's probably eventually going to care. In this case, Social Security will eventually care. So if, when you're on that boardwalk, if you're earning under what that SGA amount is, or if you are able to tap into some of the work incentives we're going to touch on that brings that countable income below the SGA amount, nothing changes. You're going to keep walking on that boardwalk. You're not probably going to know anything's different because nothing should be different. It's only once you start earning over that SGA amount and or you don't have any of those work incentives that you can tap into, that's where eventually your benefit will pause. Now, because we love graphics, you will see that there's some light blue boards. The very first one is the cessation month. So Social Security likes to give a very fancy name. Once you start earning over at SGA, that very first month, they call that cessation. Really, it just says, we're going to give you a check this month and the next 2 months. We want to give you a little grace period knowing that your check is going to pause. So that's the nice thing, so that you get a little buffer even if someone's planning to work off of benefits. Now, as I mentioned, Medicare is the last thing that's ever going to go. If someone's wondering how long will they actually have if they want to work off of benefits, as with many things, that's a complicated answer. They get at least 93 months or over 7 years after their trial work period ends. However, there's a calculation that Social Security will do once someone's actually terminated to definitively say this is when their Medicare will end. So if someone is planning to work off benefits and have that question, they'd want to chat with us. But typically we could estimate, but really it's Social Security doing that calculation once they are officially terminated. But they, long story short, just have a very long time that they could be having Medicare after they're even terminated. So a couple different work incentives that I mentioned that might be bringing that countable income down to where it's not over SGA and someone can just keep on keeping on that boardwalk and nothing change. So one of the most common that we see is an impairment related work expense, or IRWE. I am not asking you to count the number of acronyms, but you've probably guessed, yes, there are a lot of acronyms with Social Security. So an IRWE is an item or service that's enabling that beneficiary to work, and it's related to their disability. Now, that item or service, as I'll jump on the next slide, it's very broad. They intend it to be, applicable to a lot of different disabilities, a lot of different situations, but it has to connect due to that person's disability. And it's a cost that's paid by the individual and not reimbursed. So it's them paying out of pocket. It's not, an employment network or Vogue Rehab or someone else providing that money to then either reimburse them or pay them directly. And the expense has to be considered reasonable. Now, that does not mean cheap. If the need that someone has, that item or service, let's say there's only a handful of options available and they all average around $500, that could be that expense at $500 is reasonable. Maybe someone, let's say a laptop, and they're like, I could get the $800, but I really want the 5,000, all the bells and whistles. Unless there's really that need, that 5,001 will probably not be reasonable, but we don't know the situation. There might be something that they would need for work. So that's where we'd want to be able to talk with the individual, but just because something is expensive doesn't mean that it couldn't be considered reasonable. It just depends on the situation. The beneficiary would want to keep any receipts and submit those to Social Security for approval. And this can apply both to SSDI, those Title II programs that I'm talking about, and then also SSI, which we're going to tap in Tammy in a little bit as well. And this only applies once that trial work period is over. So I know I've had individuals that they're working on their 9 months and they're like, I know I pay this medication every single month. I want to submit it. Social Security, remember, doesn't care about SGA until once your trial work period's over. So you just want to tell them, keep track of things. Once you hit that extended period of eligibility and after, that's where you can tap into it if your earnings are over the SGA amount. So a big question to think for a beneficiary, is there anything that you're paying out of pocket due to your disability to enable you to work? And they might not be thinking, oh yeah, I need to take, Tylenol every single day for migraines. That could be something. The big piece is they have to be earning over SGA where it would matter. So if someone's earning, let's say $1,300, that's well below the SGA amount, they don't have to worry. So this is something where, especially if someone's getting close to that limit, remember I said it's a decision, not a number, that's where this is one that we could really talk to them about and see could they tap into. Like I said, this isn't an exhaustive list, but this is just some common examples that we see with IRWIs, attendant care services, counseling and medication being a big one, medical support devices that maybe isn't being paid by their health insurance, over-the-counter items. If someone has a service animal, if anyone has a dog like me, there's a lot of things that go with having an animal, and then having a service animal on top of that as actually providing support for your disability. There's a lot of things that we could tap into for an IRWI. Transportation can be an IRWI. We say it depends. There's a lot of different factors involved. So that's where we'd really want to talk to someone and hear what is that situation. At the end of the day, I know Misty, Tammy, and I would all say, submit it to Social Security. If they say no, they say no. But transportation isn't guaranteed just because there's a lot of different factors. Someone could be paying supported employment services or even other work equipment. But really, if it connects to someone's disability, they need it for work and they're paying for it, it could fit even if it doesn't fit under these major categories. Now, the next one I want to touch on, this is another work incentive that may bring someone's countable income under that SGA amount, and that's called a subsidy. And this one can be a little tricky to understand just because how the wording sometimes comes from Social Security. So a subsidy is where an individual is receiving on-the-job support that may result in them receiving more pay than the actual value of the services they perform. Remember, Social Security's definition of disability is all about how much is that person earning and are they able to perform enough, that SGA amount where they could technically care for themselves, cover their expenses. Really, how I like to frame it is it really reflects the employer's willingness to work with the employee, provide accommodations, and be supportive. So an example that I like to give is, let's say someone got hired in a job. Anyone in that job would have 100 different tasks that they would have to do. And let's say the beneficiary looks and they're like, there's these 20 tasks that due to my disability, I'm just not going to be able to do. They talk with their employer. There's not really maybe an accommodation they can put in place. And the employer, instead of saying, hey, we're going to only schedule you for fewer hours, we're going to give you a lower rate, we're going to pay you the same as anyone else, you just focus on those 80. Now, as an advocate, that sounds, yep, the employer sees what you can do, is very supportive. But if they could, or if they wanted to, let's say they were paying the person less than. So Social Security in that example, if that person's only working and doing those 80 tasks, Social Security could look at that and say, yep, you're providing a 20% subsidy, so we're not going to count about 20% of that person's earnings, to really reflect that they're not doing, maybe they went to a different job, had the exact same expectations. Maybe that employer doesn't do that and says, nope, we're just going to have you work fewer hours. So it's really tapping into, are there accommodations in place? Another one that I like to highlight is maybe someone gets more breaks. Maybe during an 8-hour shift, anyone else would get 2 15-minute breaks. But maybe the person with a disability needs 4 15-minute breaks. That's where Social Security can look and say, hey, there's this percent of that subsidy where you're still saying, hey, we're going to pay you the same. We're not going to worry that you're going to have to take a couple extra breaks in there. That is an employer being very supportive. So sometimes we have to talk to employers and say, this isn't a bad thing. This is you being supportive, and we want to make sure that's reflected on the person's account, because then that would actually enable them to work more, because not all their earnings are being counted. So this can be tricky, but it can be really powerful. And I know Tammy has had a lot of stories recently of different situations where she could put in a subsidy. Even Misty just had another one. So it comes up and is very powerful. So some of the employer questions, there is a form that the employer would fill out. Does the employee complete all the usual duties? Do they report regularly to work as scheduled? Do they receive any special assistance? Trying to get at, are there those different accommodations? Are those things set up in place which the employer might not even be thinking about? They're just like, that's how we do business. We provide accommodations, but really getting them to think what sort of support may be happening. So during this boardwalk, like I said, there was the brown section where you're just trucking along, you're still getting your benefit check. If you start earning over that SGA amount, we have that light blue section where you're still going to get a check. It's your little grace period, that transition. And then once you get after that, you're still on the boardwalk. This yellow is to represent that your check pauses. Now, the nice thing during this boardwalk, you can go in and out of pay status. So let's say someone got to the 4th or 5th of these boards and something changed with their health, they had to cut back, maybe they had to stop working. If they contact their local Social Security office, they can get a work review started and they can get their check back into pay status. So this boardwalk is to say, hey, you're still protected, you're not terminated. It'll just pause if you're over the limit. Now, our traveler is now at the very end. They're on the green board. So if someone is still earning under SGA after those 3 years, they're just going to be sitting on the very edge of the water, just chilling out, still getting their check. Nothing will change. If someone at any point, maybe it's right when EPE ends, 5 years down the road, whenever, after they've made it across that boardwalk, if they start earning over SGA, that's where they are terminated. And that could be anytime between the end of EPE and their full retirement age. Now, the question often comes, okay, I worked over SGA, I jumped into the ocean, treading water. What happens if something changes then? Maybe, they're 2 years out and their health changes and they can't work at that level anymore. Are there any protections? Yes, there's a work incentive called expedited reinstatement, where if a beneficiary's benefits were terminated because they worked and they had earnings over SGA, it wasn't that there was another reason that Social Security found that they weren't medically disabled, it was because of work, they can request to have their benefits restart and they don't have to go through where it's like they were starting at ground zero. So in the graphic, we have someone swimming towards the boat labeled EXR, EXR being you have that option. Now, you don't have that option forever. It's within 5 years from the month their benefits were terminated. So a pretty generous, 60 months, where if something changes, they could request EXR. Now, like I said, it's because they were terminated due to work earnings. They're not performing SGA in the month they request reinstatement. And it's either that same disability or related to that original disability which they received benefits. So my example is, let's say someone originally was on benefits due to cancer. They started working, they eventually were terminated. If their cancer would come back, that could be an example of EXR because it's that same disability. If it was a completely different situation, maybe they were in a car accident, that's where it wouldn't be the same and they would likely need to go like it was just a new application. Now, it's called expedited. We can't promise how fast it is, but there are provisional payments that you can receive for up to 6 months while they're making that decision. And if they ultimately decide, nope, you can't get back on those benefits, you don't have to pay back those provisional payments. So it's a really nice sort of safety net if someone's like, I do want to work off benefits, but I'm just scared something can change with my health, because I think they know more than anything that something can change and not be expected. And now what's that plan? So we do have, this is the full road trip. Essentially, we made it to Virginia. Yay. We do have actual handouts of this. So if anyone would like an electronic or even a physical copy, please let us know. It is just a really nice guide if someone's looking at it to be able to follow along and be like, okay, yep, this totally makes sense. Because if you're trying to read, a full page of this, it can just get very confusing. So a couple things to wrap up with Title II benefits. So oftentimes this is where we can, if someone's receiving a Title II benefit, like Misty said, after 24 months, they will get access to Medicare, but they could also tap into Medicaid through Medicaid for employed people with disabilities. We like to say Medicaid is like a house. I know Misty and Tammy are laughing because we always do that. But there's different ways to get Medicaid. And this way, which side window on the second floor, this is if someone is between ages 18 and 64, they're working. Now, there's not a certain income amount that they have to be working. It could be they're doing side jobs up to, they're working almost full-time hours. Their countable income does have to be less than 250% of the federal poverty level. There is a calculation, and it'll be the calculation that Tammy's going to explain in a little bit. So even though someone may be at 250%, that they're doing a lot of deductions on that. So for this year, until we get the new numbers, it's a little over 3,000 for a single person and a little over 4 for a couple. So this is how someone could tap in, even especially if they aren't eligible for Medicare yet. They're in that waning period. If they're working, this could be a great option for them. There is a resource and asset limit of $12,000 for an individual and $13,000 for a couple, but retirement accounts are excluded, which is really great, especially because a lot of times we know disability doesn't just happen when you're born with it. You might have retirement accounts from earlier work and you'd still be able to keep them. Now, there is a premium based on someone's income. This is a dynamic PowerPoint, so this will take you right to the MEPD page that provides more information on those premiums. And the last thing I'm going to touch on just before I hand it over to Tammy, we briefly mentioned self-employment. Self-employment, we could do a whole several hours on, but just know that is an option. And Social Security, they know that there's an extra tax that you have to pay when you're self-employed. And so they're counting not just what your income is. You would report your gross earnings minus any of those business expenses, and they would take that amount times 0.9235. So they're counting about 92% of your net profit. Now, it's important when someone is self-employed that they're tracking their hours and any profit and loss in that month, and they'll also want to submit their annual tax return come tax time. There are some potential work incentives we're not going to go into, but know that if someone is looking at self-employment, we want to talk to them because there's going to be a lot more moving pieces than if someone's in wage employment, but it is completely possible. And I know Misty and Tammy can talk about a lot of success stories of people starting their own businesses. And with that, I'm going to turn it over and Tammy's going to talk about SSI.
Thanks, Jenny. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about some SSI work incentives. Like Misty went over SSI and kind of what it is, and these are the work incentives that kind of go with that. Earned income calculation is one of those work incentives, so we're going to talk about that and how that looks. And you guys might be familiar with that already. Impairment related work expenses. So Jenny talked about experiment or the IRWI, and you can use that on SSI too. So you just build that into the calculation. Plan for achieving self-support, which we'll talk about. The student earned income exclusion. So if somebody meets the requirement for that, then they can keep their SSI from being reduced. And that's what these work incentives are all tied to do, is to help keep the SSI benefit from being reduced. 1619B, which is a Medicaid work incentive, and we'll talk about that, and a BWI, which is basically like an IRWI for someone who has a blind diagnosis. So if somebody is blind, chances are they can use a BWI. So we don't really go into that, but if anybody meets that criteria or wants any info about a BWI, just reach out and let us know. Next slide, please. So SSI comes with Medicaid, or Medicaid comes with SSI. They're kind of one and the same. If somebody is getting a cash payment from SSI, they're automatically getting Medicaid. There's no wait list. And it's like I say, it's boom, they're an SSI payment, they're receiving Medicaid too. There are other Medicaid eligibility groups, like Jenny had talked about MEPD. You know, we also work with 300% groups. Sometimes that's where kind of Medicaid waiver comes before the disability, or I guess where waiver comes before Medicaid. There's Iowa Health and Wellness. There's quite a few different, like Jenny had mentioned, Medicaid's a house, and there's different Medicaid groups that we can use to keep someone tied to different services. And most of them can pair with Medicare. The only one that really can't, that we work with regularly, is Iowa Health and Wellness. If somebody has Iowa Health and Wellness, it does not play nice with Medicare. So you have to have one or the other. But in most cases, like for example, if someone has SSDI and they have Medicare and they're eligible for MEPD, they can actually have both. So it's important to know that some Medicaid groups do pair with Medicare and can cover some of those out-of-pocket expenses. Like with anything else, they're not all equal. So some Medicaid groups have different asset and earnings limits. So it's important to know which Medicaid group someone is tied to so that we know which kind of how to tell them what'll happen when they go to work. You know, for example, 1619B Medicaid has that $2,000 asset limit. MEPD has the $12,000 asset limit. So knowing which Medicaid group that person has is very important so they know what they can do, or if they're eligible for a different group that would be a better fit for them. Next slide, please. Now, the general exclusion and earned income exclusion. Basically, what this means is that Social Security does not count dollar for dollar somebody's earnings when they go to work. They first do a general exclusion. They disregard $20 right off the top. And that doesn't mean that that person's losing anything. It just means Social Security is not counting everything they're earning. Then they have the earned income exclusion, where they disregard the first $65 of the earnings plus 1/2 of the remainder. And in the next slide, we'll see what that looks like. So for example, if someone had earned income only, which means that they didn't have any unearned income, which would be SSDI, for example. So in this case, someone has SSI and they have a job where they're earning $885 a month. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to subtract $20 off the top, that general exclusion. Then we're going to subtract $65, that earned income exclusion, divide that by 2, and that means the countable earned income is actually $400. So instead of Social Security counting all $885 of that person's earnings, they're actually only looking at $400 of that earnings. So we take the federal benefit rate for 2025, which is $967, subtract the $400 of countable earned income, and that means that person's new SSI payment would be $567. So they're not losing all of their SSI payment, which is great because that means they get to maintain their Medicaid as well. So in this case, someone has $567 of SSI plus $885 of gross income. That means they have $1,452 in their pocket rather than just the $967 of the SSI check that they normally have if they weren't working. which means in most cases, when someone's receiving SSI, they're usually better off by working. And we have to put most and usually in there because it also matters what other benefits that they're receiving as well. So we have to look, are they receiving HUD? Are they receiving SNAP? How are those benefits also going to be impacted? Next slide, please. One of the most powerful work incentives that are tied to SSI is 1619B. And Iowa just happens to be a 1619B state, which means that what 1619B means is that if a benefit goes to, an SSI benefit goes to zero because of work activity, then that individual can still keep their Medicaid as long as they're under the $2,000 resource limit and they're under the Iowa federal benefit threshold. And they haven't released the 2025 numbers yet, so we just have the 2024, and that's $45,246 per year. So as long as someone meets that criteria, then they can still keep their Medicaid. In the example we have here, we have someone who's earning $2,000 a month from work. Once we do the calculations, that means their SSI payment goes to zero. So in this specific case, this individual would be eligible for 1619B as long as they, again, maintain that benefit threshold or under that, and they still need Medicaid, and they're under that $2,000 asset limit. Now, the good news about this is if somebody is utilizing 1619B and in that zero SSI payment status, if something happens to their job and they're no longer able to work, they're still tied to the benefit, which means all they have to do is call Social Security and say they're no longer in pay status, and boom, that SSI payment goes right back up. So it keeps them tied to the benefit, but it also keeps them tied to Medicaid as well. And they don't have to pay for it. It's absolutely free because they're entitled to it because of the fact that they meet the criteria to enable 1619B. In some cases, it is not automatic. Most claims reps at Social Security understand what it is and will just start it if someone meets the qualifications. But it's never a bad idea that if you know someone who's eligible for this or will be eligible for this, to contact Social Security and say, hey, we want to enact 1619B, just to make sure that everything goes smoothly. Next slide, please. Another work incentive we use is Plan for Achieving Self-Support, or PASS plans. So what a PASS plan does is it allows somebody to set aside income or resources for a specified period of time to achieve their vocational goal. And how this looks is, for example, let's say that somebody is a dual beneficiary. They're receiving both SSI and SSDI. What we can do, and they want to save for a car so that they can go back and forth to work. What we can do then is we can write a PASS plan that says this person is going to set aside all but $20 of their SSDI payment. And in exchange, Social Security is going to give them a full SSI payment. So they'll be able to set aside that money that they were losing anyways because their SSI was being reduced. So they can then save that for that vocational goal. It's a good way for someone to be able to save for those items that they need in order to work. And most, I'd say 90% of the time, it's probably a car that we use that for. That can begin at age 8 or age 15. Someone already has to be receiving SSI or must meet eligibility requirements, must have income or resources to set aside. So if somebody were just receiving SSI and they wanted to do a PASS plan and they weren't working, well, they don't have anything to set aside. So that means that they have to have either work income that we can set aside or an SSDI payment that we can set aside. If someone were working, then we would do the income calculation to determine how much of their work income they'd have to set aside. If it's unearned income that they're setting aside, then it would be all but the $20. It has to be an attainable work or vocational goal. We have to write this plan. It's a fairly lengthy plan that's approved by the PASS cadre at Social Security. So it has to be attainable, and it has to be financially feasible to set aside or save income or resources, which pretty much means that if somebody has, they have to still be able to pay their rent and pay for their groceries and different things like that. They can't just put all of their money that they're living on into a pass plan and then have nothing left to live on. So we have to show how that's also going to work. But it is a great work incentive, and we love writing pass plans. So if you have people that are interested or know anybody who's interested, please just feel free to reach out to us directly and we can talk to you about it. Next slide, please. Examples of past expenditures: attendant care, child care, education or training, equipment or tools, items and capital for a business, supported employment services, uniforms or special clothing, vehicles and related expenses. It is a non-exhaustive list. Again, I would say 90% of the time we're probably doing vehicle or related expenses, but this can also be used if somebody's going through the self-employment program at VR, they could use a pass plan for that match. So that's a way that they could use it. They could also use it to pay for their own supported employment services. Let's say that this person wants a job coach, but they don't meet the criteria for waiver and they don't meet the criteria for VR to pay for a job coach. Well, we might be able to write a pass plan to pay for that job coach, and some ongoing support. So there's a lot we can do with the past expenditures. So just let us know if this is something that you think, again, that anybody you know could utilize. We'd be glad to talk to you about it. And next slide, please. Another thing I wanted to talk about today is Ticket to Work. So some of you might actually be employment networks. So what Ticket to Work is it connects beneficiaries with employment networks to achieve their work goals. And in other words, if everybody who's receiving SSI or SSDI has this Ticket to Work, it's not really a golden ticket that they get in the mail that they hand to an employment network, but they have a Ticket to Work that they can utilize and connect with these Social Security approved employment networks to help them find and maintain employment. It's absolutely free, it's voluntary, and it provides choice in obtaining services. So the individual can shop around for an employment network that works best for them and then assign their ticket to that employment network to get help finding employment. As long as somebody is making timely progress, which means earnings over time, they eventually have to get to the trial work level, substantial gainful activity level, then they're also protected from a continuing disability review while using that ticket. And eligible beneficiaries have to be between the ages of 18 and 64. So it's not changed to full retirement age. There is still that 64 age limit. But we always encourage people to look for employment networks in their area and what they offer, and to utilize those employment networks if they think it's going to help them find and maintain employment. If someone didn't have uh, the ability to earn up to trial work level or didn't want to earn up to trial work level, then assigning their ticket to work really isn't necessary because it wouldn't benefit them, but it is a great program that can help people find jobs that they're interested in. And the website is right here, SSA Choose Work website that offers more information, along with the Ticket to Work helpline number that we utilize quite a bit for clients because that's how we get referrals. Next slide, please. Another thing I wanted to talk about today is ABLE accounts. So some of you may be familiar with ABLE accounts. So ABLE accounts are tax advantage savings accounts for eligible individuals with disabilities. Pretty much what this does is allows people to save past their asset limits to maintain their needs-based programs like SSI, SNAP, and HUD. It's used to cover any qualified disability expenses. So as long as someone draws that money out just for a qualified disability expense, it still doesn't count as an asset towards those asset limits for needs-based programs. In 2025, someone can contribute up to $19,000 per year, and beneficiaries who are working can actually contribute an additional $15,060 on top of that $19,000 for 2025. So someone can actually save beyond that $2,000 asset limit and be able to have something that they can use in the future for those necessary expenses if needed and not risk losing their needs-based programs. Next slide, please. To use the ABLE account, someone has to be diagnosed before the age of 26. That's actually going to change, and you'll see that at the bottom of the slide. Someone has to be eligible for SSI or SSDI, so one of the following of these is true. SSI or SSDI due to a disability, experience blindness as determined by the Social Security Act, or have a similarly severe disability with a written diagnosis from a licensed physician that can be produced if needed. And that's an important statement because that means that someone does not have to be Social Security defined disabled in order to qualify for this program. Let's say that someone started receiving disability benefits at age 30, but they started the process with their physician at age 22. They would then qualify because of the fact that they were diagnosed with a disability before the age of 26. So just because that person received disability benefits past age 26 does not mean that they still don't qualify for the program. The Age Adjustment Act is going to start in 2026, and that changes the age limit from 26 to 46. So that's actually going to make it so a lot more people will qualify for this, which is a really good thing. ABLE is easy to utilize. It's easy to set up. You don't need an attorney. It's not like a special needs trust. It's literally an online savings account that someone can set that money aside in, or family members can set that money aside in to save for those expenses for that beneficiary. This is going to enable an estimated 6 million more Americans, including 1 million veterans, to become eligible once they do that ABLE Age Adjustment Act. So we're really stoked about that. Next slide, please. Some qualified ABLE expenses are assistive technology, basic living expenses, education and training, financial management, health and wellness, housing, legal fees, transportation, anything that can be related to the person's disability could be a qualified ABLE expense. Some people will use this to pay their rent. Some people will use this to pay for gas or food or any other expenses they have. It's a lot more convenient to use an ABLE account, I guess, than a PASS plan, because a PASS plan you're saving for a specific goal. With ABLE expenses, you can just draw that money out when needed for those qualified expenses. And like I say, you really don't need approval from DHS or Social Security to do this. This has really nothing to do with Social Security or DHS. All they need to know is that it's an ABLE account, and then they leave it alone. If somebody draws the money out, they just need to keep access of what they draw, like a receipt, for example, or what they use that money for, so that it is not considered an asset. So if somebody were to go to Walmart and, let's say, buy a big screen TV, well, that might not be a qualified ABLE expense, so then that could be considered an asset. So it really could be used more for a savings program than a spending program, but it does allow for families to save and to get past that pesky $2,000 asset limit that they haven't been able to get past in the past for individuals to be able to use. Next slide, please. Additional ABLE account facts. So any resident paying state taxes who contributes to an ABLE account can deduct contributions from their adjusted gross income of up to $5,800. So you get a tax incentive for contributing to an ABLE account. Account assets grow deferred from federal and state income taxes, and withdrawals are also tax-free if used for qualified disability-related expenses. So some more positive facts about ABLE and why it's important to utilize those. Next slide, please. Now, if anybody has any information that they would like about ABLE accounts, they could reach out to us, or you can go to any of these links that are in this PowerPoint, and it'll give you information about Iowa's ABLE account, as well as the ABLE National Resource Center. Now, it is probably beneficial if you're an Iowa resident to do an Iowa ABLE account just because of the tax incentive, but someone could actually shop around from different states and find the benefits of the ABLE account and could really sign up for an ABLE account in any state they wanted, just because it's an online account and they're not really tied to the state that they live in. But like I say, there are some benefits if you're an Iowa resident to doing an Iowa ABLE account. Reminder that ABLE accounts only protect an individual's assets. An individual's earnings are still counted towards the SSI cash benefit, which means that they're still going to do that reduction on the SSI benefit, but their Medicaid's going to be protected because they're not going to be stuck to that $2,000 asset limit. And that's what that ABLE account is going to do, is help protect those needs-based programs that parents have been worried about their children losing for years. So that's a super important thing. Next slide, please. And I think Misty's up.
Thanks, Tammy. So now that we've given you a ton of information this afternoon, even with a little math, you're welcome for that. Let's talk a little bit about how do you even make a WIPA referral. So before we do that, actually, let's go through a few of some scenarios to see if you've been listening of how or if a person is a good WIPA referral. So first we have Bruno. Bruno is giving us a call and he's applying for Social Security disability benefits and thinking about working. They want to know how much they can earn. Is this a good WIPA referral? You can put that into the chat. Either a yes or no. Do you think it's a good WIPA referral? Let's see what you got. And Jenny and Tammy can help me watch that chat. We're getting a few yeses, a no. Well, Jim, I think you got this one because Bruno is applying for Social Security benefits. And in order for WIPA to work with someone, they have to be already approved for disability benefits. They don't necessarily have to have received a check yet, but they have to have that stamp of approval before we can work with them. Yep, way to go, Jim. Next slide. Here's another one for you. If you get a call that Sarah's inherited $20,000 and is being terminated from Medicaid and SSI for being over resources, Sarah isn't working. Is she a good WIPA referral? Put her in the chat. Let's see what you think. We got to know. Who else? Any other thoughts? Yesterday we did a presentation and we were catching everyone on these. Great. Yeah, you got it. You got it. No, this isn't a good WIPA referral. And that is because Sarah's not working. And it would kind of depend. It's kind of a maybe on this one because if she's thinking about work and receiving SSI, then maybe it could be a WIPA referral. But at this point, she's not working. So it's more of a what happens with that inheritance question based off Medicaid. So you're right. No, she wouldn't be a good WIPA referral at this time. Next slide. So on this one, we have Theo. He tells you that he just started a new job and he'll be earning $1,200 a month. Theo receives SSDI and has not worked since receiving benefits. Theo wants to know if their benefits will be affected. What do we think? Is this a good one? There we go. Lots of yeses. Absolutely. We can't fool you guys today. Absolutely. Way to go. Because he is starting a new job, he receives benefits and has questions related to that. He absolutely is a good WIPA referral. Good job. Next slide. This scenario, Billy receives SSDI and has been working for the past year in a full-time position. Billy tells you that they have not reported their earnings to Social Security and received a letter stating that they're in an overpayment. Do you think this is a good WIPA referral? What do we think? A lot of moving parts with this one. Mari's in for a yes. You're right, Jim. Good time to talk to us. Yep, you're right. They are a good WIPA referral. This is the type of situation we absolutely want to be talking to people about because there could have been a work incentive, like Jenny and Tammy both mentioned. They're depending on which program they're receiving benefits from, there could have been a work incentive implied that they may not even know about that could have brought that SGA amount below or their earnings amount below SGA so that they would not be in an overpayment. We've had a lot of cases like that recently of thousands of dollars in overpayment when actually they had a work incentive that should have been applied that wasn't at Social Security and they were able to get their overpayment completely wiped. Next slide. So this one we have Remy. He has had a disability since age 3. They're not currently working. Remy's interested in learning more about ABLE accounts. Is this a good WIPA referral? What do we think? What do we think? You guys are on it today. Good job. Yeah, absolutely. Because we don't know how old he is right now. And although we love to talk about ABLE accounts all of the time, Remy's not currently working, so they aren't on that continuum. Unless they're thinking about work and hit in that age part of it, then perhaps we could make them a referral. But on this situation, no, not a good referral. Great job. Next slide. Now we have Chase. Chase receives Medicaid and is interested in working. They do not receive disability benefits, but Chase wants to know how their Medicaid eligibility will be affected. Is this a good WIPA referral? What do we think? I see some no's coming through. You got it. And the reason behind that is they don't receive disability benefits. Like we mentioned early on, if somebody is coming to us as a WIPA referral, they have to be approved for benefits or be receiving either SSI or SSDI or one of those two, Title 16 or Title 2, to be able to be a referral. Next slide. So what does make a good WIPA referral? We've kind of went through that already, but we really want to hit it home. Go ahead with the next slide. Is part of that piece, which wraps into the final reminders, is that we have to have somebody who is on that employment continuum. They have to be thinking about work, actively working, actively job hunting, thinking about self-employment or doing self-employment and receiving disability benefits, then hit in that 14 all the way up to retirement age. So those are the criteria that we can do. A couple of reminders is that, like Tammy mentioned, we are not an employment network for the Ticket to Work program, although we do fall under the legislation for Ticket to Work. But we are happy to point people in the right direction to the Ticket to Work helpline and get them connected with an employment network that will serve their needs. We're kind of like Switzerland in that we got to give them all of the choices, right? Also, WIPA only supports Social Security disability beneficiaries, like I mentioned, on the employment continuum. And then WIPA only provides support to those folks who are receiving or approved to receive benefits. And lastly, the biggest thing for us, and we get a lot of calls on this, is that WIPA does not provide support with applying for Social Security benefits. We really encourage individuals to connect back with their local Social Security office to get support with that. Unfortunately, in Iowa, there's not a ton of places you can go to get help with that without having an attorney. So we really encourage you to chat with your local Social Security office to get some support there. Next slide. So we wanted to include some additional resources. That includes your local Social Security office. You can put your zip code in there, or the beneficiary you're working with zip code in there, and it'll pop up which office that they should be connecting with. We included the Ticket to Work website. We've mentioned it several times on here. We've also included a link to our kind of work incentive Bible, if you will, the Red Book on Employment Supports, and that's updated annually. It really gives a good but brief overview on work incentives and the different programs that we've talked about today. We've included a link to our Disability Rights Iowa website, where you can also do an online intake form for not only our services, but the other services that are offered at Disability Rights Iowa. We've included Disability Rights Iowa's YouTube channel, and I encourage you to hop over there and check out the videos that are on there. Lots of different things that have been included on the channel, but one I would really want you to check out is there are some vignettes on work incentives. You may see a familiar face that just briefly touches on work incentives to kind of give you a question answer about what that work incentive is and how somebody can go about applying it. So head over to our YouTube channel and check that out. And then, of course, our Iowa Northwest Illinois WIPA Facebook page link is here as well. As a team of 3, we do our best to keep that updated. Might not be in real time, but We're trying our best. So that's that link too. And just as a final reminder, remember that Social Security disability beneficiaries can work. They can do that and receive benefits or get support in working their way off of benefits. It's not our job to tell them which way to go. We're just giving them the whole picture so that journey is something that they can make educated decisions about. Next slide. And there is our faces for you. We have a couple of things that I did want to quick mention before we're out of time here, and then we'll open it back up for questions. We list here the Ticket to Work helpline as our first step in making a WIPA referral. And the reason we do that is because, as you know, a team of 3 covering that much area needs some support in triage and figuring out who is WIPA eligible, who is not. And the Ticket to Work helpline folks can do that for us. They may even be able to answer some basic benefits planning questions. And what's really great about that is when somebody calls the Ticket to Work helpline, they will get a referral to us in real time. And then we're required to have 5 business days where we reach back out to that beneficiary, whoever's listed as the contact person. Having said that, most of the time when you connect with a Ticket to Work helpline, they're going to refer somebody who's actually working, right? So although we encourage you to do that, don't think you can't still reach out to us, because if somebody's in those earlier steps of that employment continuum, we still want to talk to them. So connect with us through our general number here that's listed at DRI. Like I mentioned, there's an intake form that you can put in there on our website as well, and our intake folks at the Des Moines office will get those people connected with us. Because again, we don't want anybody to fall through the cracks, whether you're working or not working. Just know there's a door to get to us. And even if you aren't sure which way to go, shoot us an email and we can get that kind of ball moving for you, and whichever way that is. Okay. Questions. I think that's it for slides, right? 50 something, yes. Yeah. Okay, great.
If folks
Questions.
want, they can unmute and ask questions, or type them in the chat.
And remember, this is just part 1. We're going to come back and really hit home on transition and the work incentives that come along with that when we get together next month.
Oh, thank you, Misty, because that's what I was going to remind folks as well, is that our next community of practice is February 13th. They're always the second Thursday of the month, 1 to 2 or 1 to 2:30. Bill.
I have to ask a question. So, one thing I want to make a comment that I always was so excited that y'all are doing Northeast Illinois, because living on a border state, you come in contact with a lot of folks that just aren't getting a lot of good services or information, and so they cross over, and that river shouldn't be a barrier. And it too often was, and it's on every level. So I just love that they're doing that. You guys are doing that, so it's amazing. Just if you could touch, I guess, something I know National Down Syndrome Congress is looking at, especially self-advocates, is the marriage penalty. And it's not good, and it's just sad for folks because it inhibits them from actually getting married, and a lot of them don't because of that. So just maybe touch on a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Jenny, Tammy, either of you want to take that one?
I'll jump in. So if you're not familiar with it, there was, I want to, Patrice, the movie, that probably was a really good example that came out in the fall of last year. I can't remember what streaming service it was on, but really highlighted that there is a barrier. We talk about marriage equality, that now we have it, but truly that's still a barrier for people with disabilities. So we talked about, if you have SSI, they will look at your spouse's income, they look at your assets. And so if someone has SSI and their spouse doesn't, oftentimes when they get married, they will lose SSI because in theory, their spouse can afford to their bills, their expenses, and can essentially take care of them. And that harkens back to, decades ago, there was not the same assumptions about disability that someone would be able to live a full and happy life and have access to having a job and marrying and having kids. And so that hasn't been updated. So unfortunately, there are individuals who will not marry, who have to stay separated from partners. Because even if presenting as a married couple, even if you're not, can get you essentially married in Social Security's eyes. So there have been bills that have been put forward over the years on the federal level, because unfortunately it would have to be a federal change to where, one, they're not counting, the spouse's income, or, at least if two SSI individuals get married, they only get 150% of the benefit. So even if it's two people with SSI, they're not getting essentially the same rights as they would as a single individual. So if you want to know more, Patrice the movie was just a really good, relatable example, but there's a lot of different articles out there that talk about that we're not really to marriage equality yet.
Thanks for bringing that up, Bill. It definitely is something that's at the forefront of our minds when we're talking to people about that, because they're like, oh, we'll just live together. And it's like, well, great. But make sure you're connecting with Social Security and letting them know what's happening, because they will change your status if they know about it or whatever. Thank you for letting us know about the live link too. Oh, Jenny, you beat me to it. They've been updating their website. So some of those you might get a little glitchy, but put it in the search bar when you're on their page and you should be able to get to it. Let us know if not, and we can try to get you a new link.
Any other questions or comments folks have?
We did such a great job. Nobody has questions today.
Bill,
Bill's back. I'm excited.
Bill's back. All right.
excellent.
Sorry, I do
No,
just
don't
have
be.
a comment that is related, not related. I don't know. And it's more of an advocacy thing. And I think most of you probably are aware that the Department of Labor may be coming out with a new regulation regarding 14C. And the National Down Syndrome Congress and other groups, I know the DD Council is looking at it too and looking for comments to get sent in. I think there's a quick turnaround. I think it's next week they want to buy. I know NDSC does. And you could email Heather Berner Sachs there. I could put her email address in the chat if anybody's interested in what they're really looking for are success stories of folks that have moved from sub-minimum wage to competitive integrated employment. So any stories that you can share. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. That's great.
That's something too. I was just going to say after that, Bill, is that we are already talking with folks coming out of 14C facilities, workshops, because benefits planning is so critical. Because if, maybe somebody's been paid a piece rate for the last 20 years, and now they're going to go and work somewhere and make minimum wage, whatever that might be. That is definitely a conversation we want to have with folks, because people are freaking out. I'll be honest. They're not sure what that's going to look like. So if you know of someone that has questions like that, please have them reach out to us. We want to make sure they're getting accurate information. There's a lot of benefits planners across the state. Don't get me wrong, they do great work, but sometimes there's a level that you just kind of have to go to that we feel like we can help them with. If that makes sense.
Absolutely, Misty. And I think, over the years that I've worked in supported employment, I have to say that I think the number one fear that people have had is the threat of loss of benefits. So the complexity of benefits planning and just today, it was a good sampling of all the different scenarios you can sort of look at or potentially use to provide information to an individual so they can make an informed choice of what makes the most sense for them. And that it isn't just this hit a wall loved your visual, because it isn't just hit a wall. And yeah, there's nothing, even to know you could swim for a boat, if needed. It's just critical. And I feel like we don't have near enough resources around this. So please talk about it, share these, come to our February 13th session to get more on this, but focused on youth and transition age youth and considerations. And thank you so much. Thank you, Misty. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Jenny. It's fabulous. This is hard information, and you made it fun and interesting and palatable, even with some math.
Even with some math, we try to do it, especially in the afternoon.
I know.
Thanks so much for having us. We look forward to next month's session.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.